class. Today I want to talk a little bit about close reading for motif. And so we're, as you can see, at the beginning of part 1, chapter 2 in passing. And just to summarize this part, I know that you've already read this part, but we're back in Chicago. Actually, this is Irene Redfield's flashback to Chicago. And you'll remember at the beginning of the chapter, it's really hot and Irene feels faint. And so she hails a cab, and the cab takes her to this really fancy hotel called the Drayton. And at the Drayton, she gets tea, and she's really intent on looking around. She's really vigilant, and she is just looking and seeing. And so I'm going to read this little part to you, and you can see it here at the bottom of page 14 in the online version, but it's also on page 14 in our text. And I'm going to read it out loud to you. And you can pause this video and grab your text if you haven't gotten it yet, or a piece of paper to write down all of the site references that you hear as I'm reading it to you. Presently there were voices, a man's booming one and a woman's slightly husky. A waiter passed her, followed by a sweetly scented woman in a fluttering dress of green chiffon, whose mingled pattern of narcissus, jonquils, and hyacinths was a reminder of pleasantly chill spring days. Behind her there was a man, very red in the face, who was mopping his neck and forehead with a big crumpled handkerchief. "Oh dear," Irene groaned, rasped by annoyance, for after a little discussion and commotion, they had stopped at the very next table. She had been alone there at the window, and it had been so satisfyingly quiet. Now, of course, there would be chatter. But no, only the woman sat down. The man remained standing, abstractly pinching the knot of his bright blue tie. Across the small space that separated the two tables, his voice carried clearly. "See you later, then," he declared, looking down at the woman. There was pleasure in his tones and a smile on his face. His companion's lips parted in some answer, but her words were blurred by the little intervening distance and the medley of noises floating up from the streets below. They didn't reach Irene, but she noted the peculiar caressing smile that accompanied them. The man said, "Well, I suppose I'd better," and smiled again and said goodbye and left. An attractive-looking woman, was Irene's opinion, with those dark, almost black eyes and that wide mouth like a scarlet flower against the ivory of her skin. Nice clothes, too, just right for the weather, thin and cool without being mussy, as summer things were so apt to be. A waiter was taking her order. Irene saw her smile up at him as she murmured something, thanks maybe. It was an odd sort of smile. Irene couldn't quite define it, but she was sure that she would have classed it, coming from another woman, as being just a shade too provocative for a waiter. About this one, however, there was something that made her hesitate to name it that, a certain impression of assurance, perhaps. The waiter came back with the order. Irene watched her spread out her napkin, saw the silver spoon, and the white hand slit the dull gold of the melon. Then, conscious that she had been staring, she looked away quickly. Her mind returned to her own affairs. She had settled definitely the problem of the proper one of 2 frocks for the bridge party that night, in rooms whose atmosphere would be so thick and hot that every breath would be like breathing soup. The dress decided, her thoughts had gone back to the snag of Ted's book, her unseeing eyes far away on the lake. Then, by some sixth sense, she was acutely aware that someone was watching her. Very slowly she looked around, and into the dark eyes of the woman in the green frock at the next table. But she evidently failed to realize that such intense interest as she was showing might be embarrassing, and continued to stare. Her demeanor was that of one who, with utmost singleness of mind and purpose, was determined to impress firmly and accurately each detail of Irene's features upon her memory for all time, nor showed the slightest trace of disconcertment at having been detected in her steady scrutiny. So you could hear me emphasizing some of those sight words, but do go back if you haven't yet and underline the sight words that you see in those pages or make a list. And what do you think? I think what we have here is a motif. How do you think that motif might be informing a theme that might be starting to take shape already. Well, I hope that you are well, and I look forward to seeing you all soon.